Okay. So we're gonna go. I like my shirt, Cthulhu. Uh, why vote for the lesser of evils? Buddy of mine gave that to me. I enjoy it. All right. So I want to get through some things. I have five of these books set up. I'm not going to go through like the entirety of this. There's one sort of stanza from the Tao Te Ching that I want to go over, and there's I forget how many, 82 or 6 or something like that. I forget exactly. 81. I always want to say it's more than 81, but it's 81, which makes sense to division of 9. But there's one I want to kind of go over, and I have 5 different versions of this because it's all translated differently. They're all translated differently. So sometimes word choice will make kind of all the difference for some people. And I try to do this when I teach like Tai Chi and stuff like that, or I give um, like sort of a visualization. I try and give several. Like for example, if you've watched any of the meditation ones, I talk about the relaxation. I'll think of ice melting, or a knot untying, or a bowl of light, or a like candle flame. I might think of just telling yourself just to release or relax. There might be imagining like a sound or a vibration, because people are going to learn differently. People are going to think differently about all this other stuff. So I try and give as many options that I can so people can kind of get it to figure out and put in where I can. Now, I'm going to give a quick preface to this. I am not an expert. I have been playing like Taoist sort of stuff, like Tai Chi and Qigong and meditating and stuff for almost 21 years. I do not consider myself an expert. I do not, I've read several books on Taoism and Taoist thought. I've watched a ton of stuff. Again, I've practiced these things for a long time. I've had some training in like Chan Zen Buddhist things, actual training, not just sort of reading or learning. I don't consider myself any of these things. Yes, Taoism and Buddhism technically have things in them that people deal with it as a religion. I don't. When I practice these things or I read about them or anything, I don't go at it in terms of a religion. There's spiritual practice in with it. There's a lot of things in terms of consciousness and all that other stuff. I'm not practicing it as an actual religion, and I'm not pushing this in any sort of actual religious context for it. I am not a trained Taoist. I haven't gone to like Wudong Mountain and set any precepts and taken any vows. I don't know if they let me because I can't grow hair and get the proper top knot, not the sort of like little fancy boy knot tie up thing that people are doing now. Excuse me a second. Cat has learned nothing from jumping through a screen window. Sorry. So again, I'm not an expert. I'm not a Taoist official. I'm not coming at this in terms of trying to now push a certain agenda on it. It's really just getting involved with the thinking aspect of it, and part of this might be I might be busting this out now because we've been locked down for a couple months, and I've told people one of the worst things you could do is give me time to think, because then I might start getting kind of like, this is where we're gonna go. So I'm trying not. I don't want to be pushing anything. I'm not trying to now make any conversions or any of that other stuff. Um, and I'm not an expert. I'm not going to go through each and every chapter of the Tao Te Ching. I don't really believe, despite the fact I've read it many times in many different translations, I don't consider myself an expert. I don't consider myself a fully awakened, enlightened being that can be able to now fully elucidate on the full meaning of it. I'm not some sort of rebirth of Chuan Tzu or even Lao Tzu, if Lao Tzu is even a person. or Sun and Funk. I'm not, I'm not putting any of that other stuff out there at all. There's just some things that I want to be able to sort of pass along and talk about, and I think can have a benefit and help in some ways. So I'm only going to be reading the one stanza, but I'm going to be reading it from the different versions from that. It is stanza 71. There is a couple of reasons why I picked that one specifically. I'm not going to go into all those right now because they're actually kind of not pertinent. So yeah, it was just interesting too. It just made me think about this. I remember I did. There was a couple of people when I was working in Parmadale, working in the residential of it, that I did sort of say, hey, how about you read some of these, or how about you do this? Because I had a couple people, one in particular, who wanted suggestions for reading material. And I was like, well, what are you looking for? Because, I mean, asking me that is, you're opening any amount of floodgates. I mean, do you want to go old classics of dead European people? Do you want to go like weird fantasy sci-fi stuff? Do you really want to challenge yourself? Because I know I'm just going to give you the Silmarillion. And then they'll give me a good excuse to read it again because, oh, you're going to ask questions, so I'm going to need to read it again too. Darn. Or anything else like that. Or do you want like, weird, funky, occulty things? Do you want like, again, Taoist, Buddhist, Shinto stuff? Like, what do you want? So he was like, yeah, some of the Tai Chi stuff because I was running Tai Chi groups. So we had like a field trippy kind of thing, an outing to the library, and I got that and a couple other things for him. And he read it, and like a few days later came to me, and it was interesting. The question he asked was interesting. It was like, how do you read this and follow it and still live in the world? And it was a wonderful question, absolutely wonderful question. And I told him that too. I was like, man, that was probably one of like the like hardest hitting and really sort of big sort of really amazing questions I've ever been asked with that too. I don't remember what I said at the time. This was like 7, 8 years ago, something like that now. But my answer then is probably going to be maybe not very, but it is going to be different than my answer now. Not only has my life significantly changed in a couple different ways during that time, very significantly in a couple ways, but also my practice and training has gone in all sorts of wonderful and weird, strange things with that too. And part of my answer now would be, part of me would be really tempted to almost sort of give like a sort of Zen answer and just sort of look at him and kind of like, sort of thing, and not, because that's almost the best answer I can give. But part of it would also be the idea of when we're talking about my idea of non-attachment has evolved over time. And one of the things that's helped me, honestly, has been listening to a lot of Alan Watts lectures. Alan Watts was amazing in being able to sort of take the different philosophies and ideas and mythology and religions from India, China, and Japan, kind of specifically, and being able to translate them in a way to the West that doesn't have a lot of sort of Western, I say prejudice, I'm not meaning necessarily prejudice as in an ethnic, racial sort of thing, but in terms of applying the conditioning of how we use language and our materialism on it. So that's helped a lot. There's another person, Thomas Cleary, if you ever go into a sort of like Asian studies section of any bookstore, his name of translating things is going to be all over the place. Trust me on this, having worked in a bookstore for the better part of 11 or 12 years at one point in time, first a Walden's and then a Borders, his name's fairly ubiquitous if you go into that sort of, oh, we're just going to lump Asian stuff in one place. But my idea of non-attachment has evolved, and that idea is more to the idea of not necessarily not attachment of now you're aloof and this sort of almost sort of cold floating being apart from everything, and now you're some. No, 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 no. Because if Star Wars has taught us anything, having that can also be a certain amount of sort of diseased, polluted, sort of toxic thinking that kind of makes you a bag. Non-attachment with this is, okay, you have an idea that comes up, and that idea comes up, and then it goes. You start thinking about that idea too much, and then maybe that's when like depression or anxiety or stress starts coming, or now you start kind of spiraling and getting your own little thing, almost like a golem, and everything, and then or we see that in our political climate on either side of things. It's like, well, this is the way it is. No, this is the way. No, this, and that non-attachment becomes an attachment on its own. So you have, okay, there are things. So, for example, I've got roommates. I got a new guy upstairs and people downstairs. The people downstairs, they're a couple. They apparently have friends. They like to have friends over sometimes, and I'm sort of like, people are making noise around me. Grr. It's like there are sounds, they come in, and okay, there are sounds, there are people doing things, and that's it. Not sitting here and going, I want everyone to be shut up, or not like, oh man, I really want to be join them, which I kind of don't. But not having that where now I'm thinking about that thought. That thought is there are people here, and then you start thinking about that. That's attachment to it. That's the sort of attachment that we're trying to, I don't say get rid of, but sort of dissolve. And so if you're doing your sitting, you're doing your meditating, thoughts come up, sounds come in. Okay, you're sitting here, and I live, I live where I hear airplanes and helicopters and sirens, and people walking outside, or people downstairs, a guy upstairs, kind of boom, 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 boom. So it's like, all right, well, you live all that and just sort of not, oh, that's a siren, oh, that's the guy upstairs, man, I wish they'd shut up, just a helicopter, just go. You're more of a screen door, letting those things sort of pass through you, and yeah, maybe some things kind of might get stuck or anything, but you're still, the screen is still there to try and make sure some other things don't kind of come in and infest, but the other things are allowed to go in and out too. So that idea of water that keeps moving, because stagnant water becomes diseased as well, but that water, that stream, that river, or whoever, so Buddhist, Taoist stuff talk about that all the time. It's really, if you read Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, which I do recommend. The translation I had was pretty good, and it's fairly short. It goes pretty quick. I read it in, I think, a night. And I'm a slow reader too. But that was really what kind of got the guy who was sort of paralleling the Buddha. Was he was kind of working at this ferry, and he sort of just learned from water, and that's the thing. It moves. If there's a leaf on it, it kind of goes. The water doesn't go, holy crap, there's a leaf. If the big rains come and there's a big flooding, it's like, okay, well, we're flooding now, and that's where we go with it. And it's dry up, and there's sort of a drought. It's like, okay, there's not really a lot of us, and we're just going to kind of wait here until that happens. And if it falls, it's just rolling down the thing, and then maybe sometimes there's a little hollow, and it kind of gets back behind the rock, and then maybe over time the rock chips, and now it goes and has more freedom for it. So that's kind of where we're going with non-attachment, more necessarily than trying to be some sort of aloof, almost inhuman being. That doesn't help, because then now that almost starts removing people even from compassion and empathy. And all these things are talking about compassion and empathy as well. And they'll even say in some of these ones, Lao Tzu, Chuan Tzu, all these other things, it's like it's real easy to be a hermit in terms of your spiritual development. It's not really easy to make your own clothes and grow all your own food and all this other thing, especially in this day and age, because if you can't or won't do any of that, there's going to be some human interaction. You're going to need to have some sort of compassion and empathy with that. And also non-attachment in terms of the way we might see that in the West, where you're this closed little seed off into yourself. You close yourself off from the truth of now what we're talking about in terms of just consciousness itself. We don't even have to talk about sort of spirit or soul or anything else like that. They're coming from that tradition, and even if we just talk about it, that tradition, they're coming from a more closer to the idea of our brains are not the generator of consciousness like we might think of in terms of a really materialist reductionalist sort of idea of the last couple hundred years in the West. They're coming more sort of the idea of the brain and the body is the sort of receiver of consciousness. So it's more like your TV or your radio. So, you're, it's a little bit easier if you think about it in terms of airwaves. So, older TV, with the rabbit ears, or the radio with the antenna and everything like that. Those channels, those stations, even on cable, those stations, all those are going to be playing anyway. That's still out there. If your equipment is kept up well and working all right and tuned in correctly, you'll catch whatever station it is that you're looking for. So, and people are like, well, if someone, has a traumatic brain injury, or there's some sort of congenital problem, or, there's schizophrenia, or there's some sort of other stuff like that, or there's mental illness, then people's behaviors, so what are you going to say to that? Well, what happens if, you know, you you have a short in your radio? You have a short in a radio in the car, the thing's going to be fuzzy, and maybe you can't get the stations correctly like you used to. My car is a case in point. I had a short in the thing. They replaced some of the stuff or fixed something in the radio. I can't get a lot of things very well anymore. You got a TV, you trip and fall, you catch yourself, you kind of crack the screen on the TV. That doesn't mean that the station that you're getting is bad. It doesn't mean that the station is wrong. There's something with your physical equipment that isn't quite, what would be ideal. So now if we're trying to connect in with those sort of stations, the idea, and then the idea is now if all those stations really come from one source. So that one source is putting off those different sort of stations, and those different stations are sort of the people. So now, but really it's all the same thing. It's all the same source. So locking oneself away, trying to say that is non-attachment, is sort of incorrect in terms of what those cultures are trying to say. Because separation, you're still thinking of yourself separate, but separation is really what is the ultimate illusion and even delusion that we have, that it's all separate. So all that mind, all that consciousness is really from one thing. And the idea of, if you think of coming in from any sort of mythology, the four main creation myths from Egypt, even from Norse mythology, even from sort of Judeo-Christian things, and even from science, there's always a sort of beginning point where nothing is different. It's all one. It's all sort of a thing of itself. The Egyptian ones have like sort of the waters of chaos. It's this thing, but it's all together. There's no separate out. And then over time, different things come up and give birth to other stuff. In Taoism, they have Wuji, which is sort of the undifferentiated whole. It's just is. And then Wuji goes into Taiji, which is a sort of a one thing, a grand ultimate. So when you hear Taiji Chuan, Tai Chi, they're not talking about like Chi as in the energy. It's Taiji, which is the grand ultimate, the singular thing. And that breaks off into yin and yang. Yin and yang now breaks off into greater and lesser of each. And then we also have the five elements from, if we're going through like Chinese thought, where Taoism comes from. You have where now it breaks into the five elements with that, but you also get, now you have, the eight trigrams, and the eight trigrams make the 64 hexagrams from the I Ching, and those things make the 10,000 things. And when they say quote unquote 10,000 things, they don't mean literally 10,000, it's just everything else. So the sort of undifferentiated whole breaks down into everything else. And the idea, if we take a sort of symbolist view, so sort of talking about like John Anthony West sort of thing, a symbolist, symbolic view of these mythologies, then what we want to do is we want to take those 10,000 things and then bring them back up. So this is where we start getting into like Jungian archetypes, where now instead of everyone, we've got 7.5 billion people in the world, 7.5 billion personalities. But what if we sort of pared that down? So now there are these handful of archetypes that people kind of go by, and no one's going to be perfect with that. Everyone's going to have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but maybe there's a prevailing one. And now with your thoughts, you go, oh, instead of all the thoughts ever, we bring it down to where now we're starting to think of now these sort of bigger, it seems bigger, heavier sort of things. So now what are we talking about? If we're talking about, the eight trigrams, have like heaven and earth and water and fire and thunder and mountain and lake, they have these sort of things with that. So now we're moving up back into that, where now it's more general. And now we start talking about, oh, what is greater yin and greater yang versus lesser yin and lesser, versus now we go up into what's yin and yang, what is essentially yin and yang, and then we bring that together, and then we let go of that too. So that's more sort of talking about non-attachment, talking about what we're trying to do with the mind, and what a lot of these things are kind of going. Now again, this is an imperfect representation by someone who is a student of these things and trying to work these things out for himself and all that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this sort of like part A, and then part B will be the Tao Te Ching stanza that I want to read. Now, Tao Te Ching, Tao meaning like way of, Te is like virtue, and Jing, and this is being the book. Now, I'm probably slaughtering the inflections. There's like 4 or 5 in Chinese, even if we're talking about Mandarin versus Cantonese, and there's tons of different dialects all over the place. But, the two sort of main ones that are generalized are Mandarin and Cantonese. I believe Tao Te Ching is more Mandarin. I could be wrong on that. But again, there's different tones with it as well. So to native speakers and people who have studied the language, I apologize, for any time I slaughter language. I'm one of those ones that tries to say things as correctly as I can, regardless of the language. So I am kind of maybe attached, maybe a little picky about it. But I try and give that sort of respect to the language that's not my own. I do try and speak English the best that I can. It doesn't always work too well with that as well. So it's basically like the way of the book of the sort of the way of virtues. And so there's one stanza, going to be stanza 71, and I'll break this into 2 parts too, so it's not just one huge thing, especially since I kind of went off tangentially on non-attachment. So this is going to be 1, and then the next one will be 2 about Tao Te Ching stanza 75. If you have a Tao Te Ching and you want to kind of look it up with this, especially if you have one of the 5 versions that I don't, feel free to bust that out and kind of go along. And just, again, this is going to be from someone who is not, technically haven't taken any Taoist vows or precepts. I've never been to like a Taoist temple or a holy place or anything like that. This is just my understanding of this right now. I probably should have said that to the lead up, So the lead up to the next one might be a little repetitive to this. So I'll just do that now.